So we are going to continue with the Hartman curriculum on faith. The Shalom Hartman Institute is where I actually spent quite a bit of time studying, but it is an institute that was founded in Jerusalem by Canadian Rabbi David Hartman of blessed memory, continued now being run by his son Daniel Hartman. And they've really made it their mission to bring pluralistic Jewish education through teaching of our traditional texts to lots of different populations. They do classes for North American rabbis, they do classes for Israelis, they do classes for Jewish educators, they do classes for Christian clergy. They started a couple years ago a cohort of Muslim leaders. They do things for secular Israeli soldiers. They now have a gap year program for college students. So they're doing quite a bit in the way of Jewish education. And a couple of years ago, they did this adult education curriculum for North American Jews, and we were chosen to be a pilot. And so here we are. And we did their entire ethics curriculum. We had a bigger turnout for ethics, not surprising, smaller turnout for faith. I think that also says something about our congregation, very specific about our congregation. But today we are going to talk about where ethics and faith, well, I don't know if I would say align, but where ethics and faith, we're going to be discussing the connection between ethics and faith. And so, one of the things that I've heard a lot my whole life is what an evil force organized religion is. More people have died because of organized religion. So I usually don't say this. It depends who's saying this to me. I usually don't say more or less you could leave the Jews out of it, because we really, as far as organized religion, we didn't have a lot of power. Maybe we'd had more power, we would have had a worse track record, but leave us out of the evils perpetrated by organized religion, because we weren't really part of that. And then I usually mention Hitler and Stalin. There plenty of evil has been perpetrated not in the name of religion. But the issue of where I think religion gets a bad name is really the question of where faith and ethics intersect. And so the question that we're really going to be looking at today is, what is the moral basis of what is the basis of ethics? From where do ethics stem? And we all may have different thoughts on this, but it's very clear that Judaism, or traditional Judaism, or observant Judaism, has basically one answer, or maybe two, which would be, if I asked you, according to Judaism, where do ethics come from? What would the answer be? Eileen, I could see mouthing the Torah, right? The Torah. And where does the Torah come from? I can see Didi mouthing God. Okay. So in Judaism, as probably all religions, or all theistic religions, would say that ethics flow from God. God has a set of ethical behaviors that God wants us as human beings to do. And so in order to be faithful, we follow them. When my kids were little, and I don't know, one of them would hit the other one, I wouldn't say don't hit your brother. I would say, the Torah says, do unto others as you would, if they were rude to us, I would say the Torah says, honor your mother and father. I felt I don't think whether you're an observant person or a not observant person, children should be allowed to be rude to their parents. But I thought it was, a way of sort of rooting the ethics that we were trying to teach them in the norms of Judaism. And I believe that there's something really powerful about that, right? It's as opposed to what my mother used to say was, do it because I told you to. So, right. Which actually became a much more valid reason as I became a parent. I thought it was, when I was a kid, I thought it was ridiculous. But as a parent, I thought, this is a good, it's a good enough reason. But because I had said I was never gonna, I mean, I did say it on occasion, but I wasn't gonna say it to my kids because I didn't like that my, mother said it to me. I'm like, okay, do it because the Torah says so. So it works really nicely, except for what's the problem? Where is the, and we're going to look at some different sources on this today, but where does this start? Where does this sort of break down? What are the challenges of saying that ethics are based on our ethics are based on the belief that there's a right way and a wrong way to behave that's come through God? What are the challenges to that theology? Marcia, you guys can just unmute. We're a small enough group. Just jump in.
You can say it, but how do you prove it?
Okay, you could say it, but how do you prove it? That would be one, once you say, as long as Jewish society believes that the Torah came from God, it was relatively easy, right? Once that broke down, so then the question would be, well, how do you prove it? What else?
There's a lot of stuff in the Torah that we don't particularly agree with as being the right thing to do. Like, stoning people for gathering sticks on Shabbat.
Right. So there are ethics in the Torah of the way people behave in the Torah that we would say is not ethical. And probably, I mean, yes, like collecting things you're not supposed to do on Shabbat. But one that we really struggle, well, I don't think we struggle with it some more, but we struggled with it for a long time, was homosexuality, right? If the Torah says it's, abhorrent, then what are we supposed to do when ethics, modern ethics, comes into conflict with something that the Torah says? What else? Yes, Marcia?
There was all that research about, is there a historical basis for the Torah? Is it really true? And again, what does true mean?
Right. So if human beings wrote it and I don't believe that it's from God, then what does it mean to me? And that, look, this is a whole bit, this is a big challenge to it, right? I don't believe in God. Well, if I don't believe in God, then, then where do my ethics come from?
Right.
And also, I mean, an abortion is probably, an issue, right? I would say right now is that in Christianity, God says one thing about abortion, and in Judaism, God, let's say, says something different. So what happens when not everybody believes the same thing about what it is that God says? And sometimes people use God, and this is where it gets into religion can, perpetrate a lot of evil, that people are very willing to use God in all kinds of ways. Like, for those of us that have traveled to Europe, and I have a limited amount of cathedrals I can visit in one trip, but if you go to England, right, you go to London, and there are shrines in the cathedral thanking God for the victory of a certain battle, right? And then you go to France, and there's another shrine at another cathedral thanking God for the victory against England. So whose side was God really on, right? Like, people claim God on their side for all kinds of things that have nothing to do with what's written in the Bible. But, I mean, I always think this is somewhat amusing, the sports figures, right, who not only pray to God, but attribute their victory to God. And it's like, if you die, God must hate Chicago, the Cubs, I don't know. It's like, listen, I think there's something humble about attributing your gifts and saying, because we all have gifts that we were blessed with. And they didn't come necessarily from anything that we did. They just came from something that we have. So to be humble and recognize that we are recipients of gifts that are above and beyond our, maybe we work hard and we may be dedicated and all of that, but, I could never be a football player, no matter how I could practice every day, or a ballet dancer, right? Like, there are just certain gifts that I didn't have, no matter how hard I worked at it, that I would ever be able to accomplish something. So I think there's something humble and modest about attributing that you have certain gifts that you were blessed with that other people don't have. But I don't know, certain victories that God's on one team versus another. So all of these things sort of bump into how we then deal with the intersection of faith and of ethics. So, and then of course, there's the question, we're going to look at three different long, one's short and the two other are contemporary, so they're longer sources today. But then, you know, the question is where do ethics come from? One of my absolute favorite, I would say it's probably one of my favorite movies, but it's also the best Jewish movie that was ever made, The Quarrel. So The Quarrel is a movie that is based on a story by a Yiddish, I'm blanking out on his name. His first name is Chaim Grada. It was based on a story by a Yiddish writer by the name of Chaim Grada. Chaim Grada is an outstanding Yiddish writer. No, but very few people have heard of him compared to like Isaac Bashevis Singer, but worth reading. And he wrote a book called My Quarrel with, I think Herschel Rosiner was the name. So the story is, both the story and the movie are excellent. They're not exactly the same, but in any case, the base, as these things tend to go. So the story is basically takes place on Yom Kippur, 1948 in Montreal, where accidentally two men who had been childhood friends in Vilna, who both survived the war, but had not been in touch with one another, ran into each other accidentally. One of them, they both had met in yeshiva, and one of them had sort of a crisis of faith as a young person, as a teenager, had left the yeshiva, become secular, and one had stayed in the yeshiva, and that broke their friendship. The one that stayed in the yeshiva just could never understand or accept that anybody could leave that world and become secular, and their friendship was over. They both survived the war. They both lose wives. They both lose children. They both lose everybody that they had ever known in their town, all of their families, everybody, right? And they reunite. They see each other on Yom Kippur. And the religious person went through Auschwitz and stayed religious. And the secular person went through whatever he went through and stayed secular. And a lot of it is the quarrel, right, over what all of this means. But the question that the secular person asks, and it's a theme, right, is how could you have lived through Auschwitz and still believe in God? And the Orthodox person says to the secular person, how could you have lived through Auschwitz and still believe in people? And it's if you haven't seen the movie or you've seen it a long time ago, it's worth seeing because it's really rich about a lot of questions about theology, but particularly that, right? The question of if you believe that morality is from God and you believe that God is not responsible for all of these evils in the world, and you still, believe in God, and then you can feel good about the fact that morality stems from God, and very skeptical about morality stemming from human beings, because human beings can be very much the flavor of the day, right? Like, I have this thing, you all have probably heard me say this, but I do not like, judging Abraham Lincoln by the times that we're living in, or Thomas Jefferson even about the times that we live in. I think this is a little off topic, but yesterday I participated in something that was really lovely. Zionist, this organization that I'm very involved with, took a group of Zionist leaders, and I happened to be one of them. There were like 10 of us, and we each read a selection from in honor of Martin Luther King Day. And I think it was Facebook Live. I never actually saw it, but recorded us each reading a section of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. So, which was very meaningful. And I actually thought a lot about Rabbi Frankel. I mean, I really felt if I was doing it in anything, I was doing it in his memory. But one of the young 20-somethings, when he got to his section, Martin Luther King used the word several times, Negro. And this young man kept saying every time he was supposed to read Negro, said African American. Like, this young man could not bring himself to say the word Negro. And I thought, you're editing Martin Luther King. Like, I just want to say, you're editing he said mankind, and people read mankind. They didn't say humankind. Like, now this is the point that we've come to, that we can't even directly quote Martin Luther King on Martin Luther King Day to honor Martin Luther King, because he used words that by the standards that we live in today might deem to be, it was just, to me, I'm like, this is the crazy times that we're living in. So the problem with saying that ethics, stem from human beings is that human beings are, so Judaism, so we're going to look at some sources today that talk about then how do we, how do we balance this, right? How as Jews, or as modern and contemporary Jews, how do we, so we're only going to look at really one, not even that traditional of a source, and the other sources are contemporary sources of asking the question, how do we balance this idea that some of the morality in the Torah we would find offensive, and how do we balance with some of the morality of human beings we might find ridiculous? And so how do you sort of walk that walk as a moral and ethical person, and presumably a person, let's say a person who at least attempts to be a person of faith? So the first source that we're going to look at is a Hasidic source, the Chazon Ish. So the Chazon Ish was lived in like the 17th century. He was a famous rabbi in his day. Probably nobody today has really heard of him outside of the real Orthodox world, but he was famous in his day and said the statement, Jewish law is the decisive factor in deciding what is moral and what is immoral. And stop, right? And if you were to ask anybody, most people today, I would say that we're Orthodox, if you would ask them agree or disagree with that statement, they would by and large say agree, right? If the Torah says something is forbidden, it's forbidden. If the Torah says something is permitted, it's permitted. Now, the truth is that Jewish law grows and adapts over time. It's not exactly the same as it was hundreds of years ago. But if you look amongst the ultra-Orthodox, roles of women are very limited. Homosexuality is absolutely not accepted. Now, if you look at modern Orthodoxy, you will find a wider range of opportunities within the community, both for women and for people that are LGBT, maybe not T, lesbian and gay. You'll find a more of an acceptance, but not a total acceptance, right? Not a total acceptance. And so, look, in many ways, we are watching in an ugly, I feel like watching a, train wreck, but we're watching them battle this out in Israel, right? Between an Israel where there is a vision that, Torah rules society, and therefore there can't be any acceptance, and even in the public schools, of LGBTQ students. And the person that's talking about this is like now the head of the education ministry. 80,000 people protested in the streets of Israel over the last few days about the laws that they're talking about changing the Supreme Court. But we're also hearing a lot about Israelis trying to get visas and leave, secular Israelis not wanting to be part of that society. So, it remains to be seen. But this is, this is a very unfortunate turn of events in Israel. In any case. So, but very clear, right? If Jewish law says it's forbidden, it's forbidden. If Jewish law says it's permitted, it's permitted. And, there was it's not funny, but a joke that that Rabbi Pupko likes to tell. It was an Orthodox rabbi that I've studied with for years and years, that a man goes to the Louvre and he stands in front of the Mona Lisa and he starts, criticizing, well, people have said that her smile's so this, but it's not really. And he starts critiquing the Mona Lisa, and one of the guards at the Louvre goes over to him and says, I'd like to suggest if you are critiquing the Mona Lisa, the fault lies within you, not within her. And so Rabbi Pupko would say the same thing is true about the Torah, right? If you have criticisms of the Torah, the fault is not the fault of the Torah, the fault is your fault. So you just need to work to align yourself with the beauty of the Mona Lisa or the values of the Torah, And it's not the Torah's, though, it's interesting. I was on a panel with him about abortion in Jewish law about a month or so ago. And I have to say, like, I studied with him my whole life. My whole life, since I was 30. I consider him a friend and a mentor in some ways. But I was really shocked at how hard he came down on Judaism only allowing abortion in the rarest of situations. And I was he took the most hard line on it. And I have to say, I was surprised. I was really, really surprised. But it might, it's possible we just don't, those aren't the matters of the day that we talk about. In any case, but this is not, of course, in Judaism, the last word on anything. So we're going to look at a source by a woman by the name of Blue Greenberg. Blue Greenberg is I think we could call her the mother of Orthodox feminism. She did a lot of her writing in the 80s. She's married to Yitz Greenberg, who's a very well-respected Orthodox rabbi, modern Orthodox rabbi. And she talks about, in feminism, there was, especially in the early days, there was this talk about the aha moment, right? The aha moment is the moment where you realize, oh my God, something's wrong here and it has to change. So she talks about what was her aha moment that led her into the belief of feminism, but she never left the bounds of orthodoxy. She's still alive. She stayed Orthodox her entire life. She stayed within the bounds of orthodoxy, but brought really the idea that even within orthodoxy, there could be bigger, more robust roles for women, and really revolutionized modern orthodoxy and the ability for women to become Torah scholars and to have a much greater role, participation. So she talks about her aha moment. Her aha moment is she's in synagogue on Simchat Torah, and she's up in the balcony. And all the men, it's traditional on Simchat Torah for every single, to give out aliyot to all the participants. And she's sitting there, and it's quite raucous down where all the men are, and it's raucous and it's loud, and people have been drinking. And finally, the rabbi bangs on the podium and says, "We are not leaving here tonight until every single person gets an aliyah." And she realized it didn't mean her, right? That she, in that framework, was not considered a real person. Because the only people, and now you could say he didn't mean it, what he meant was every man, but she was like, but that's not really what he meant. Like, we're invisible up here in this balcony. And so really she began her journey on a Jewish feminism. And then the question is really, is this, as some people would say, feminism, just a secular value, right, that has nothing to do with Judaism? And it's out there in the modern secular world of people that begin, you can clearly see where I come down on this, right? But where, this is just the secular whim of some people. It's something that's, it has nothing to do with us as Jews and as Jews that follow Torah. Or, do you say what the Chazon Ish said, which is if it's, halakha is the only way that we judge morality. And Blue Greenberg says, no, there's a different path. So she says, perhaps this is the only legitimate response one can make at this time, a series of tentative remarks. If feminism is a revolution, as I believe it is, and Judaism is and has always been the rock bottom source of a Jew's values, thoughts, feelings, actions, mores, laws, and loves, how can one respond to and be part of that turbulent encounter, but with a stammer, one step forward and a half a step back? I envy those who can say, this is halakha, this is Jewish law, that's it. Or, these are the absolute new truths and nothing less will do. I envy, but I also suspect their unexamined complacency. I suspect that their fear is even greater than mine, Therefore, they must keep the lid on even tighter and show no ambivalence, no caution, and no confusion. So let's just stop there for a minute. So what's she saying? You got two sides, right? She's facing two sides. One side, her Orthodox friends and neighbors, and what are they saying? Feminism, right? This is nothing to do with Judaism. It's forbidden. We don't need to change. Then you've got the other side, the feminists and their fellow travelers. And what are they saying? Like, everything has to change. Or in today's modern parlance, smash the patriarchy. Oh, yes. This is when I know that I feel old. I'm not a big fan of smash the patriarchy. Listen, there are systems in place that I think that would need to be dismantled. There's no doubt. But I think smashing that, I don't know. I don't relate to that kind of language. It's interesting because Shai told me Anshe Amit's looking for a new assistant rabbi. They have 3 candidates. One is a woman. And on her Facebook page, she has a banner, smash the patriarchy. And I'm like, wow, it's going to be super interesting if she gets this job. Again, it makes me feel very old, but maybe if I was in my 20s, I'd be a smash the page. I mean, I look back at how I was in my 20s. I might have been that person too. But so, you've got the people that nothing needs to change. And the other one is, smash everything, because it's an evil system that is repressive and repressing women. And, I don't know what it means. I mean, that's part of the issues. I don't know what it means to smash the patriarchy. If you gave me a few, steps of how to dismantle, I'd, get to work. But I don't really know what that actually means. And Blue Greenberg is, and you can see sort of, I think one can see the appeal of both sides. Like, there is something appealing about, and she says this, right? There's something appealing about saying, I know my place in the world. Judaism tells me what to do. I don't have to be torn apart by the news of the day and by the, the winds of change. And like, I've got this nice, strong, steady, safe place where all of the decisions are made for me, and if I don't know the answer, I go to my rabbi and my rabbi tells me. And one can see sort of the safety in that, right? But one can also see sort of the drama of, we need to sweep this all away. We need to, especially when you're young, right? We need to sweep this all away. This needs to change immediately. This, whether it's systemic racism or whatever the evils of society are, we have to get rid of everything, and if it means getting rid of statues of Abraham Lincoln, like we have to get rid of everything. And Blue Greenberg's like, you know what? What I really think we need is small steps. You can see why this could drive people crazy, right? Small steps, incremental change. We want to work towards change, not rush anything. Just after many years, letter from a Birmingham jail, one of the things that Martin Luther King, he's responding to criticism of white clergy about, this types of protests aren't the way to do it, and you need to be patient and you need to wait. And he's like, how much longer are we supposed to wait? Anybody that tells you to wait, anybody that's on the side of telling you to wait is not on the side of change. And how much longer are we supposed to actually wait? Though while he wanted things to change, he, certainly wasn't as, he probably would have liked bigger, not small, incremental, much bigger steps, but he was not radical compared to other leaders of his day. And I would say even, certainly, of course, compared to other leaders now. So she calls for small incremental steps. For me, despite the turbulence, or maybe because of it, it has not been all bad. I have had some very good feelings in the course of doing this work. The best of these has been a sense of being able to approach the sources without intimidation. So part of her, what she brings, and this is really revolutionary in Orthodoxy, that the sources are all there for women. And a lot of women studying to be, they don't call themselves rabbis, they call themselves rabbah. And there are many of them now in Orthodoxy and women's yeshivas and modern women's yeshivas where they study Talmud and they study all the same sources as Jewish men do, because it used to be that women couldn't study Talmud. A lot of that is really attributed, you could attribute this to Blue Greenberg in North America and her work with other Jewish feminists to insist that Jewish women had as much a right to these sources as Jewish men. The fact that I can think about the traditional sources without knowing them exhaustively. So I don't have to be the expert in everything, because that's part of where they get you, right? Like if you're not an expert in everything, then you can't, have an opinion. The fact that I can think about the traditional sources without knowing them exhaustively, that I can bring to bear my own interpretive keys without diminishing the divinity and authority of the halakha and tradition, this has been a revelation for me. So too the experience which all women alive today share of stretching ourselves, our minds, our talents, our sights. Transition women like myself are taking everything less for granted and finding each step more exhilarating. One of the things that she talks about in her book is going to synagogue. In the Orthodox world, it is very accepted, particularly when women have young children, to stay home on Shabbat, right? To stay home with the children on Shabbat. Because you can imagine, it's a schlep, they walk on Shabbat, the weather, if you have multiple young children, the double stroller, and she talked about that she forced herself to go to synagogue, even though it was hard. And even though she knew that there was no expectation that she had to be there. And she said, if I don't force myself to do this, if I don't say, force myself to be an active participant, waiting for somebody else to do it, then nothing's going to ever change. And I have to say, I thought about that a lot when I went through all of my own sort of decisions around becoming a rabbi. And because I wanted Judaism to change, because I wanted there to be a place for women and of course I chose the conservative movement, not Orthodoxy, because I wasn't as comfortable with as slow as the change was in Orthodoxy. I wanted much bigger change and much more equal access. But it was hard to think about, is this something I'm really going to do? It's 6 years of rabbinical school. It's a lot of work. It was a lifestyle change for me because I didn't grow up observant. And I remember thinking, like Blue Greenberg, if I don't do this, who's going to do it? I think it's a great idea. I think, somebody else should do it. And I thought about that a lot. I thought about that a lot when I wasn't really so sure, about whether, it's funny because now in retrospect, it was such an excellent idea, but it seemed a little, at the time as a young woman, in my 20s and my mid 20s, I didn't know any women rabbis. So she was very inspirational. She was very inspirational in my own thinking about my own journey. So what do you think? Do you like this? She walks this balance, right? She's not the Chazon Ish who says all morality stems from Torah, but she walks this middle sort of ground. So speak to you, not speak to you. What do you think? Marcia?
Well, it absolutely speaks to me because I'm not an Orthodox person. And I, even in back in the old days in my Reform congregation in which I grew up, of course, women were there. They were sitting with the men. I had 5 years of Hebrew school. There were no bat mitzvahs. Oh, pardon me. There was one bat mitzvah in my entire childhood. And, I never felt I had a voice until I until I first experienced it at Hillel at University of Michigan and, just heard so much more. But once it was mine and we were part of Am Yisrael, my kids always said to me, why do you sing so loudly? And are you bragging that you know the prayers? And I'm thinking, finally, but truly it's because I always felt my voice wasn't valued as a female. And the fact that a person is a person, it it's totally validating for me. So I can't, and that's her perspective. And I could never take her perspective because I can't agree with the bounds of orthodoxy.
Mhm.
But, moving to the conservative movement has been life affirming for me.
Elise?
So I'm trying to think of this in a little bit bigger context than just sort of feminism and Orthodox Judaism. And the idea of small incremental steps and the conflict between possibly what is faith and what is ethics. And to me, what Orthodoxy, I think, is saying is faith is not faith as much as it is tradition.
Mm.
And that and it's kind of ironic because the Talmudic tradition, right, is one of argument,
Mhm.
right? It's one of different opinions, although then they settle on one, right? Right, then they settle on one and then that's it. But the tradition shouldn't, to me, the tradition doesn't mean it never ever changes again, and that there should not be additional challenges going forward. So I actually think that what I've already forgotten her name because it's not on the screen in front of me.
Blue Greenberg.
Blue Greenberg. I should just remember its colors.
Right.
So that what she says about incremental change, that's the way change is achieved, not just in Judaism, but in larger society, right? And it's true in larger society because there are always people who are advantaged by the tradition, right? And they fear losing that advantage. So I think that it's very, very frightening. And those people are often, because the traditions work to their advantage, those are the people who are often in power.
Listen, we see this politically in this country, right? Like this idea of what was this bad? Part of the issue, I think, that's also maybe we're living in times that it's hard for me. I mean, I'm sure it's hard for others, is that we've seen things move in the opposite direction. Like I remember when I was in DC the day that the Supreme Court decided on gay marriage. And, everybody put the arc of justice, like it bends slowly, but it bends. And then we've lived the last 6 years watching it go in the other direction, like RV Wade or other things. And I don't know that I was psychologically equipped for that, because I kept thinking we're making incremental changes, but they're going to keep always moving in the same direction.
I was going to say it, but progress is not
right.
It is somewhat of an illusion. The pendulum is always swinging back and forth. But I think that in that way, it makes it much more difficult to tie your ethics to your faith, right? And just say it comes from God, because it's changing, right? Because things evolve, and because our society says, the secular society says things that are different from the religious authorities.
And the thing about Judaism is and I think that sometimes in Orthodoxy they put blinders about this, is that we've always adapted to trends that were happening in the larger society, always.
Well, I mean, number one, sacrifice, right?
Like, well, the thing about, capital punishment, right? Capital punishment is now I would say even more permitted. It's required in certain cases in the Torah. The rabbis were not as comfortable with capital punishment. And so they said things like any court that hangs someone once in 70 years is called the hanging court. or you have to have two people witness the crime and have warned the perpetrator. Do you know before you strike that man that if you kill him, you will be liable for capital punishment? And if this person wasn't warned by two witnesses, then you can't convict him you can't have capital punishment. So the rabbi, and they did the same thing with slavery, right? They began to legislate it out of existence. And that's actually, I think, perfect examples, because they never said it's forbidden to own a slave. They never outlawed slavery, but they said, well, if you own a slave, fine. You have to give him such and such a place to live, and you have to give him so much food, and you have to provide him with clothing, and then you have to give like a wage. And they started, so what ended up happening is you still maybe had a slave that you owned, but it became too expensive, right? Once you're paying somebody a wage and you're paying them room and board in perpetuity, even when they can't work anymore, you're like, oh, you know what, it would really be better if I hire some day laborers. So they basically legislated slavery out of existence. Polygamy, right? The Torah permits polygamy. But the rabbis 1,000 years ago legislated it out of existence. Why? Because the rabbis that lived in Christian Spain were not going to be able to allow the Jewish community to practice polygamy, because it would have been totally unacceptable in Christian Europe. It's in Spain, but in Christian Europe, right? In Muslim countries, Jews were allowed to continue to be to have multiple wives. There's stories about when they airlifted Jews from Yemen in the 50s that some of them came with multiple wives. But in Ashkenazi countries, it was absolutely the secular, the Christian authorities would not have allowed the Jewish community to practice this. So the rabbis just legislated it out of existence. And now we think, oh, you know, Jews are always, you know, monogamous, but they weren't. No. That only happened 1,000 years ago. And, you know, in Jewish history, that's modern. All right, let's look at one more source. We're going to look at Daniel Hartman, who runs the Hartman Institute, since he brought us, his institute brought us all this wonderful curriculum. He identifies as an Orthodox rabbi. I mean, he is an Orthodox rabbi. But you know, he wrote this in 2016. So he's already coming 20 years after Blue Greenberg's writing, and is probably, you know, our society's in a different place. The truth is that monotheistic religion is neither perfectly good, and thus its failures the exclusive result of human weakness, nor perfectly evil, poisoning the character of all who adopt it with crippling spiritual disease, right? So monotheistic religion, Judaism, it's not all good, it's not all bad. This is, well, look at the title of the book, Putting God Second, How to Save Religion from Itself. Wow. Right? That's the title of the book. The central argument of this book is that religion's spotty moral track record cannot be written off to either a core corruption in human nature or an inherently corrupt scripture. Rather, it is my contention that a life of faith, while obligating moral sensitivity, also very often activates a critical flaw that supports and encourages immoral impulses. So this is a pretty rough statement, right? That religious life obligates moral sensitivity, but it can also activate a critical flaw in human beings that encourages immoral impulses. These impulses give free rein to flourish under the cloak of religious piety, undermine the ultimate moral agendas of religions and the types of communities and societies they aspire to build. The argument of this book is that its critical flaw, when recognized, can be overcome. This frequently overlooked phenomena that accounts for the moral underachievement of our monotheistic traditions is what I term religion's autoimmune disease, a disease in which the body's immune system, which is designed to fight off external threats, instead attacks and destroys the body's own healthy cells and tissues. This diagnosis is meant to help conceptualize the dynamics through which religions so often undermine their own deepest values and attack their professed goals. While God obligates the good and calls us into its service, God simultaneously and inadvertently makes us morally blind. So give me some examples. Marcia?
Being certain
Right,
having the
being right.
truth,
Right.
and therefore the power, the authority. And we know that, unreined power, unshackled power is big trouble for human beings.
Like if we think for a minute, I'll give you an example from Judaism, but the one that comes first and foremost to my mind is Christianity. How could you possibly read the teachings of Jesus and then act the way you acted in the world? Like, how do those two things actually but they did, right? They did. The power of the church, the certainty of being right, the certainty that while Jesus taught all kinds of things about loving and loving your neighbors and loving kindness and loving, if you didn't follow his teachings, then we're going to come and kill you. So let me think. I mean, listen, if you give me a minute, I'll think of some axes of Judaism too. Look, people were written off in Jewish society. They were put into cherem, right? They were exiled if they didn't believe. I mean, Spinoza, the great Jewish philosopher who did not believe what his community believed. And so the rabbis of his day put him in cherem and nobody was.
Anybody else? I mean, Spinoza's really famous, but
Spinoza's famous, but probably not probably there, not anybody of that like level of fame, but this idea that once, we talked about the quarrel, like once you're out, you're out. And
Okay.
once you're out, you're a sinner and you can't, you're still Jewish, but you can't.
And the ultimate judge may not be the rabbi, it'd be the community.
Right.
Who expels you if you don't agree with or follow their way of thinking.
Right.
So you might leave. That might cause you to leave, not that they would throw you out even.
Right. Look, I don't know if you asked most ultra-Orthodox Jews, and I expect I know you don't. Like, if you really pushed Chabad, which they won't tell you this because they're so nice, but if you really push them and you ask them, is a Christian's soul the same as anybody that's not Jewish? Is their soul the same as a Jew's soul? The answer is no. A Jew has a higher soul than somebody who's not Jewish. Like, they don't advertise that. Like when you come for Shabbos and you're at Hillel and they give you like a great dinner and wine and all, they don't tell you that. But that is really, and they're not alone in ultra-Orthodox Judaism of thinking that, I heard a comedian say this, but it's like the chutzpah of like Jews and non-Jews, right? Everybody that's not us is a non-Jew. We are an infinitesimal, we're like the teeny, and everybody else is just not us. So we, as I said, we didn't have the power to do the kind of destruction. We don't know. We weren't tested. And actually, I will say one thing at the Hartman Institute they talk a lot about is Israel being a sovereign state. And now Israel is being tested, right? The morality of how you treat the Palestinians, how do you treat people, whatever you think of Palestinian leadership and you should think a lot of bad things about Palestinian leadership and their, they don't want to, Dan goes, Dan can't stand this Israeli government, but all of the criticisms he's reading about now because of Netanyahu, there won't be a two-state solution. And it's like, has anybody mentioned that there's not a two-state solution because the Palestinians don't want it either? Like, okay, Netanyahu, what he's doing right now is terrible, but the press keeps only showing one side of the picture. So he's outraged every day. I'm kind of at my limit of how much I can. After the Trump administration, I have to take a bit of I have to stop with the outrage stuff. Like I had to look, whatever anybody thinks of Biden, I've really not had to rant and rave mostly for 2 years. And I feel like I need to keep a lid on that. It's a healthier way to live. But in any case, but now that Israel's a sovereign state, their morality is tested in a different way than when you had no power. So I just want to end by saying, there have been studies over the years to try to figure out righteous Gentiles, people that saved Jews during the Holocaust.
Right.
Did they have any common denominator? And the answer is no. Some of them were religious and some of them were secular. Some of them were rich and some of them were poor, and some of them were educated and some of them were uneducated. And as we know, they're just what Holocaust literature might have you believe there were far fewer righteous Gentiles than in popular Holocaust literature. But in any case, they had the only common thing that they had when they were asked why did they save Jews had to do with the values that I learned from my parents. That was the only kind of, and that wasn't even everybody, but that was sort of the most popular answer, right? So it wasn't because I'm a devout Christian or because I abandoned Christianity. It was really just, my parents taught me to be this kind of person. And so, I'd like to think as a rabbi that Torah, teaches us to be more moral people, but I think it only teaches us to be more moral people if we want to be more moral people. And if we don't, all of the teaching of Torah isn't going to really, change us. We have to be open to wanting to be influenced by it. Anyways, anybody have anything they want to say? So I'll give you yes, Marcia.
Gave me the opening. Once upon a time, the whole thing of chosen people was a lot more popular. And then, in my opinion, it was in about the 50s, it got kind of squashed because, let's all be Americans, and let's all blend, and etc. And when you were talking before about this sense of just a little bit of superiority, it was, so there you are with we have the truth that makes us better.
Right.
But the issue is, with whom are you sharing the truth? Are you reaching outside of the people of your community, or are you, when somebody comes in, you share that truth with them because they share it with you? I mean, the thing that boggles me is when someone who has the truth pushes it on me in terms of my actions or my limitations. That's where it just becomes too much.
Right. And Judaism isn't really a proselytizing religion. Part of that is also historical, right? Like, Jews were oppressed. Like, who are you going to go out and proselytize to? But the fact is that is one of the, I think, the pros of Judaism, right? That we don't think that everybody else has to adopt this lifestyle in order to, be saved or whatever. It's only supposed to be for inside the community. But yes, the Torah talks about we're the chosen people, chosenness. And I feel like we did give that up, rightfully so, in the 50s, not to really want to talk about it, to emphasize it, because after all, we want to be like everybody else, and nobody really wants to be with somebody who thinks they're better than you. However, every once in a while, the video goes around about all of the medical discoveries, by Jews, and there's more of us, per capita, and we're like, oh, So we take our moments where we can get them, and then we quietly move on.